Hey friends, it's me, Zoe. Welcome back to the Lightcast. Today we're going to talk about the Goddess Collection. I don't typically aspire to pick up divisive topics, but I find that this is an interesting one for me. Let's just put it that way. As a disclaimer, I want to open up by saying that regardless of how you feel about the Goddess Collection, specifically Hyrule Historia and Hyrule Encyclopedia, I just want to put it out there that I'm not gonna defend or bash it one way or another. I am just gonna talk about mistakes and contents of these books in a very statistical manner and the methods I've used to sort of put together those statistics and what they mean. So yeah, that out of the way, let's dive in. I still remember the first time I ever saw the Goddess Collection books. I was in a Barnes & Noble back years ago now. God damn, where is the time gone? And I didn't know anything about the controversy around them at all. Mostly because I just wasn't that plugged into the Zelda fandom on the internet, and didn't really have a desire to get into it because just having been around since the olden days as a person who was born in the 1900s, needless to say, the debates that I saw going on in the fandom as far back as being an active user on the Zelda Universe forums and or Zelda Dungeon forums, I just didn't really want to be part of that. So I missed the controversy with it. Everything that I was doing was very self-guided. To my surprise, it's oh my god, an art book has come out for Zelda, and I've always been a Zelda fan, and everything I've done with Zelda has been in a secondhand kind of way. I always got things I got a Nintendo 10 years after it was, I think, first released, and got the first two Zelda games, Gold cartridge, and then got a Super Nintendo, again, almost 10 years after it initially came out, and got A Link to the Past, and played a Link's Awakening on a friend's Game Boy, because we were just super poor. So in my mind, I couldn't see anything but good coming from those books existing. And that even extended to the point where when I first joined into the deeper parts of the fandom and actually hopped onto Discord, one of my very first experiences was somebody talking about something, and I referenced whether or not Termina was a dream world or a physical place or parallel reality, all of that stuff. And I cited Historia or Encyclopedia, one of the two. One of them has it. I think it's actually Encyclopedia. Doesn't matter. I got a voice recording of verbal screaming from one person, and other people swore at me. People sent me gifs of a cat hissing, and I had no idea what was even going on. I didn't realize that they were pariah to the community. Yeah. And since then, the hatred or the over-celebration of the book somewhere or the other has really baffled me. From that moment, I've started to research the controversy after waking up to, I guess, the modern age of being in this Zelda fandom, and found the claims of all the misinformation and mistakes and problems that were in them, and for years just assumed that they were kind of like that. But I'm also not a purist, in the sense that I don't think that just because a mistake is happening on worn out of 200 pages or something like that, that the entire material is bad. Because this happens all the time. Most history books have more mistakes in them than the Goddess Collection, for example. We'll get into that in a little while, though. Getting ahead of myself. So even still, there's tons of stuff that is citable that is actually from games. And I saw that the hatred of those books really, really grew, especially after 2018, which is when I think maybe Encyclopedia came out. And in every community I've been a part of, more or less, you just didn't bring it up. There was never rules against it or anything like that in most communities, despite the fact that I've been in places where a lot of people wanted them to be. But you just didn't bring it up, because if you brought it up, people were going to tell you, like, it's misinformation or it's garbage, all of that. So I finally got really curious with him this last year and ended up going through and hand transcribing the timeline that's in Historia. And I did it for a couple of reasons. I'm not going to go into all of them because one of them is for a personal project. But one of the reasons that I did is I wanted to understand for my own self what the inaccuracies were. And I ended up going through and transcribing the entire timeline, almost word for word. And some of that too is just because as a person with a huge special interest in this, that is a good way for me to just like memorize a lot of the lore and be able to make mental notes about what things are wrong or what things are right, or ask different questions about why they may have been put there. And again, like I said, I'm not going to get into defending these or bashing them or anything like that. I'm not going to get into all of the arguments about Nintendo Dream being an editorial magazine and like not being Nintendo and being involved in the process. I don't care, and I'm not getting involved in that. So we're just going to talk purely about the statistics of this and get into like percentages of content that have issues and so on. So my entire life story out of the way, I think it is time to crack one of these things open. Logically, I think it makes good sense to start with Encyclopedia the most. By far, it has more, we'll say, mistakes than the others. Which is also kind of funny because everywhere I've been, like, Historia gets a ton of press for being wrong, but error for error, percentage of content, Hyrule Encyclopedia takes the cake, as they say. So I didn't just like break these down into mistakes. I also classified them by the types of mistakes they were, and they're pretty straightforward stuff. And I end up citing it all. I'm gonna put the link to the spreadsheet into the comments or whatever, so that way if anyone's curious and they want to go looking through it or pin everything, they could do that. So I try to classify them because I think that that's an important aspect to this too. Like if we're gonna understand something to be either like having mistakes of misinformation and whatnot, like classifying what they are and what they do and what kind of problems they can cause is really important. So in that vein, one of the things I end up doing is like the list is like whether an issue is self-contradicting to the canon. For example, if something is put in a place that actually contradicts a game or contradicts itself in the same book, clerical errors, like they just truly, mistakes are made. If it contradicts another book, and then of course I did actually break it down by whether or not it contradicts a game, because I think at the end of the day the games are the ultimate canon, like they make the canon, regardless of what the books have in them. I see books as more or less being supplemental to the canon, without really being able to easily retcon a game unless we have other proof that the canon is evolving in some form. And then I have like mistakes of omission. Finally, like whether or not something contradicted a manual or if it was like misordered. In the case of contradict manual, it's probably British straightforward, but the misordered one would be like if we know for sure that the first two Legend of Zelda games are like, they come one after the other. It would be like if they put Adventure of Link first, is as my example for what I'm counting as being misordered. And then to actually populate this data and have something to work with, I was able to collect data from a few sources. One of them, which is a huge shout out to contributor on Zelda Wiki, they've contributed like a metric fuck ton of issues that are found in Hyrule Encyclopedia specifically. And I was able to do that and then go around the web and look at debates of people trying to murder each other in a comment section and see what issues were reported by people and actually populate by book like what the issues were. And that was incredibly helpful because as one person, like it's also like regardless of what I present here, people should definitely do their own research. And don't just take my word for it or somebody else's word for it that something is wrong. Because along the way, one of the things that I found was while validating all of this was like, there's so many things that were reported wrong. And I literally went through and validated every single claim that I could find anywhere. And then, of course, I went through myself and looked at stuff, and I took down notes along the way. And then went back and validated my own thinking, just to be really, really fair and thorough. And I found a lot of things along the way that just were not correct. A good example of that is, or in Hyrule Historia, they mention that the Triforce doesn't judge the user for good or evil. And there were people, multiple people on Reddit and in some forums that shall remain nameless. They were saying like that was just like contrived, it was made up, and it's like, no, that's actually in the game, and that's provable. You can go see it yourself. It's actually in the game. And that helped me to remove a good bit. I still kept them in the list anyway, but just like marked them as being not validatable. I don't think that's a real word, but it is to me. So, with regards to encyclopedia, that's where I really started first because it has like by far the most. And percentage-wise, the amount of mistakes that are in there really speak to what I think is probably the case, especially in the English copies, that the people who were putting that together, and I'm trying to be kind and not mention names because the internet is a crazy place anymore, they seem like they might have been overworked because it's like 26.83% of all pages in encyclopedia have an issue on them. Now that could be anything from a single sentence to something being misordered in a list to anything. So it's not like the whole pages are broken. Like it's not 26.83% of all the pages are just filled with garbage. That's not the case. But that's still a very high amount of pages, like with actual problems for something that has the word encyclopedia on it. And that's very unfortunate. We're going to get into the issue types because I think that's going to clarify a bunch of stuff soon. And then I also took it the other direction too. It's like, okay, so how many words are in the book? What percentage of those words are mistakes? And of those 26.83, like, since that's how many pages there are, out of the total content of the book, though, it's like 1.83% of all of it is actual mistakes compared with the total content that's provided. But what do those issues look like? Because I think that's important. So about half of the issues that are present in encyclopedia, when you get down to like just percentage of total pages, it's like roughly half of the pages that have problems on them are just clerical errors. And they are true mistakes. Like, good example, when there's like an overview of games and the games in encyclopedia, and it's got Four Swords Adventures, and it mistakenly has the description for Four Swords Adventures underneath Four Swords. And you can tell this. Like, if you read it, you can tell it is an obvious mistake. It's just clerical errors like that. A ton of clerical errors and little tiny mistakes like the two gates of time on page 26 says that it does gear him through the gate of time with Link. Obviously, they meant to say Zelda. Like, that still doesn't give anybody like a pass that there were that many mistakes that were missed throughout that review process prior to this book even being published. But that's about what that is. So like, of all the issues that are available, it's like half of them are clerical error. Almost all of the rest of them are missing or omitted information, where they had more information available to them than what they actually put into the book. Good example. This one is one of the ones that I found sourced from ZeldaWiki, so thanks to them again. Lightning rods are mentioned from Breath of the Wild, despite Breath of the Wild not actually being featured in the book. So it's like an error of omission. Kind of the wrong way for an omission, but it's fine. And then another good example of that would be the Triforce Heroes rupee table does not include gold rupees. And it's mostly a lot of that kind of thing, where they had more information available to them than what they actually put in this book. Personally, I don't feel that that's misleading. Like, that's obviously an error of omission. That is a mistake. If you are trying to build a book that is a very like a completionist kind of thing, you want it for somebody who wants to know all the things, then sure, that should have been in there. But not getting into the territory of like misleading the fan base with tacitly wrong stuff at this point. And then, so the missing omitted information makes up like 10% of all the total pages of the book. Like 10% of pages have just missing information where they had more available than what they put in. And then, next you have things that actually contradict games, which I consider to be more or less like tantamount to like kind of sinful when you think about it. Of the total pages in the book, 7% of the pages had something that contradicted a game. Now those percentages still seem pretty high over the total, but again, remember that's by like if a page contained that mistake. When you actually get into the total content of it as a whole, you get into something much smaller. So for clerical errors, it's like 0.61%. For missing and omitted information, it's 0.53%, and then for contradicting games, it's like 0.38. The other percentages beyond that are very small. Like whether they contradicted Historia or not, or used incorrect artwork. Those are very small percentages. Like some of them are under 10/1000%. So I'm not going to go into this. I just mostly wanted to talk about the big problems that are in there. Again, all this will be available in the link. One of the next things that I did is naturally getting to the point where classifying is also classifying how that might impact somebody who is just coming to know the series, because I'm just like kind of curious. And I more or less classified each issue type by whether there's like none or minimal issue. Good example. In an omitted information type scenario, a person can still play a game and fill in the gaps of that information. Theoretically, anyway. They're not going to be, no one's going to like, going back to the Triforce Heroes rupee table thing, nobody's going to see that, say like in some strange scenario where they actually bought the book first before they played the game, and then go play the game and be like, how dare these people for leaving the gold rupees out on the table, like nobody cares at the end of the day. Do I wish that it was there, like as a person who loves completed things and having like as much information as possible? Absolutely. And then I broke that, all of those things down into like none minimal, whether they would confuse the players or not, and if they broke the canon. In terms of whether something is confusing to the player or not, how I ended up doing that is like a good example. Page 128 of Encyclopedia says that ice arrows could be used to create platforms on Ocarina of Time. That's not right. That's not true. Like, you can't even do that. So like that's confusing to somebody who may pick that up and just like think that they're misremembering. So you have that. And then of course for things that break the canon, Encyclopedia says on page 134 that Cafe became the Skull Kid in the section about the Pendant of Memories. And like that contradicts the game on such a level that it's like, that goes beyond confusion. That's actually so incredibly wrong that it's almost hard to see how a person got to the like making that mistake. So that one's like labeled as breaking canon in this list that are put together. So, but what does that look like for all of these kinds of mistakes? So the one number I haven't shared is like what percentage of total content for all of the issues across the entirety of Encyclopedia. What is that percentage? That number is 1.83%. 1.83% of all content in Encyclopedia actually contains a mistake, which is actually better than most textbooks in grade school. It's not to dismiss it or defend that. because there's so many. That number could have been so much lower with a little bit more of a review process. And then of those issues, 0.95% of them are non-minimal, meaning there's no issue really. Like if somebody goes back and plays the game, they're going to fill in their knowledge that's missing because it wasn't included in the book. And then of total percentage of content that like of things that would confuse players, this like 0.4% of the entire book. And then finally, things that break canon in the book, in Encyclopedia, is 0.02%. It's actually, right now it's like one mistake in the entire book, which is the one I mentioned a few minutes ago about Cafe becoming the Skull Kid or whatever. I think it's really important to break that down and try to understand that being upset about it as something that is full of mistakes is one thing, but looking at it as and saying it's misinformation, filled with misinformation, like largely percentage of total contents that's available in Encyclopedia, it, like I said, it actually has a higher amount of correctness than a ton of academic textbooks, your Google search results, the news, for example. That's something to think about and keep in mind. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about that, of course. So naturally, moving into Hyrule Historia, I did the same thing, and I was expecting. This is a case where I definitely over-anticipated problems when I initially made the spreadsheet for it. I actually labeled each page individually because I thought that there would actually be problems on most of them, and I wanted to start from that place. Whereas with Encyclopedia, I pretty much had the page numbers between all the sources and get my initial review on it first, so I knew what to expect, and I didn't bother going, like, listing all the pages. And what I found actually surprised me, and which is that Historia has many. Geez, I cannot, like I said, I can't talk to it. It actually has much less errors. And just straight off the top, it comes off as like 3.21% of all pages in the book actually have problems. And a good chunk of those are, a mixture of clerical error or confusing the player. There is some canon-breaking stuff in that book, too, as many people know. It's been talked about ad nauseum at this point. So I'm not going to rehash all of them. But there are cases where it's very impactful to people who aren't trying to enjoy the series, I think. One of those is that Four Swords Adventures, of course, if you look at the official timeline, is placed after Twilight Princess. Regardless of how you feel about the books, whether you like them or not, that don't make no goddamn sense whatsoever. And if you go and look up developer interviews to understand like what's going on there, get that there's obviously something that went on there. There's some drama behind the scenes or something like that happened seemingly between Miyamoto and Aonuma. And developer interviews confirmed that it was intended to be like a direct sequel to Four Swords. It shouldn't be where it's at, in story-wise. It doesn't. There's so many problems with it, and I think I won't put words in the mouth of people who really dislike and hate these books, but I do think that those kinds of mistakes feel very big to those people. Understandably so. But even still, it's like, of all the content that in the entire book, it's 3.2% of all content has problems. When you're talking about a book that's that big, it's not very many, especially when you break it down into the individual types. Again, it's like clerical errors, this time percentage of content, 0.02%. Contradicting the game, 0.09%. Incorrect artwork, 0.02%. Contradicts a game manual, 0.02% of all content. And then, of course, like, classifying them like I did for the other one, or for Encyclopedia, I mean. Same kind of thing. It's like, of those, this book is actually tilted in the opposite direction, where in Encyclopedia, most of the mistakes are not things that will cause natural problems to somebody who's trying to understand the series. You have kind of flipped the other direction, where a lot of the mistakes in there would confuse a player if they read it, and they might run contradictory to their own memories or experiences playing a game. The whole conversation between the Hero Shade and Link and Twilight Princess about passing on, abilities and whatnot, that's a good example of that. And then that's 0.07%. And then, of course, canon breaking things is 0.05% of all the content in the book is canon breaking. And we're gonna get back. You're gonna start to see where I'm going with this here in a minute. Once we get through with art and artifacts, because there's a point. Art and artifacts is pretty much not almost worth mentioning. There are some mistakes in there. They are very much clerical errors, like labels being mixed up for Mulgara and Jahala. Artwork from Twilight Princess HD is used in place of Twilight Princess. That's not a big deal. That's not really going to confuse anybody. It's not going to cause a problem. It's like, if you play Wind Waker, you're going to figure out really fast that Jahala and Mulgara are not labeled correctly. Hopefully not the hard way, but you're going to figure it out. What in thinking and stepping back from these numbers, because I've been sitting on them for a good couple months now, and I'm like, okay, so when you actually look at it, for the most part, for starters, the books got more right than they got wrong by a long shot. Above 95% of the content in each book is okay. And in the case of like getting down to that specific number, it's even higher than that, of course. It's like Encyclopedia is above 98% accurate. Historia is above 99% accurate. And then Art and Artifacts is like 3 nines of accuracy, like 99.9%. But yeah, people are very, very angry at these books and have a lot of emotion about them as a whole. And I think there's a reason. I think incorrectness is the thing that gets the blame. But I don't think incorrectness is the actual root of the problem. I think that in a lot of cases, especially in Historia, with the placement of like Four Swords Adventures or the Downfall timeline, where that stuff happened off screen, I think it's, at the end of the day, they're in the entertainment business, Nintendo is, right? And people have very emotional attachments to these games. And when you start to tell them that their emotional experience with certain games is actually incorrect, I think that touches on some raw nerves for people. And I think I can really appreciate that. There comes a point where there's like some separation that has to occur though, because regardless of how you feel about it, you have some like 3 books with an unbelievable amount of information in them that is pretty much right. On the whole, it's actually correct. And there's a lot of good things to glean from that, and I think it's, again, regardless of how you feel about it, and it gets really sad as a fandom that people withhold their own enjoyment of the series by refusing to take part in something like looking at a picture on a page because they feel upset by a book. And that's really unfortunate. It shouldn't be that way. I don't put the blame on them for feeling that way, though. I put the blame on the people who just were not careful enough with the editing process. Because could you imagine, like let's just say, for example, imagine if the Goddess Collection came out and the only mistake in it, the entire thing, was just Four Sword Adventures, and everything else was wrong in all 3 books. Everything was right in all 3 books. Nobody would care. But when you start to like rack up these clerical errors, it starts to look like they were put together with carelessness, and I don't believe that they were. Reading the interviews of people who were involved in the process and how integrated they were with Nintendo throughout it, you can see that there was care, but it doesn't really change the fact of the outcome. To wrap this up, I wanted to get into what I think, some of the other impacts of this too. There are cases in Historia especially where something breaks the canon that is not shown on screen, but it is actually explainable. A good example of that is the Downfall timeline. None of us saw that. It was never on screen that the hero was defeated. But when you actually play A Link to the Past, and you're in the Skull Woods and you're talking to the maiden, she brings up the prophecy of the calamity. And from an in-universe perspective, you can actually make the logical leap that everything that's going wrong in the Dark World existing, to those characters, like, they probably thought that the prophecy of the calamity was fulfilled. And for that to be fulfilled, the hero must have fallen. And I think like from an in-universe perspective, the downfall timeline in its existence makes sense in that way. But I don't think that makes sense the way that they put it in the books at all. And to me, looking at it from the angle of talking to that maiden and what she's saying, and like she thinks that she thinks the calamity has happened, like it's on the eve of cataclysm as it is mistranslated in the English, but it's like she thinks the prophecy of the calamity has been fulfilled. So it does make sense to anybody who's making a historical record that the hero must have fallen. Even though whether or not that's actually the case, I don't know. I think that was like the best way that Nintendo may have had to connect the dots between Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past. And that totally sidesteps the whole conversation about the fact that Ocarina of Time was incepted to be it was going to be to see a war backstory, which we've now gotten with Tears of the Kingdom. So I think that there are some explanations even within those details, but they don't translate across at all. Like there's no way of knowing that unless you studied like the most tiny detail of everything. For example, if you have no life like me. And I think like that's where the mistake with those books was what they really come into play, because like without a key piece of information like that, you don't have any way to connect the dots, and it's incongruent with the player experience. And I think like it just really makes people angry. And again, I get it. I also think that they've learned some lessons since then, because if you look at Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom Masterworks, regardless of how you feel about Tears of the Kingdom, they are very accurate to their individual games. And I think that was a good lesson for Nintendo to not wait like decades later before putting together things like the Gaea's Caution, and putting them together while everyone still remembers what the story was supposed to be is really important. I think it's like something you can see that they obviously learned their lesson. They've even kind of hinted at this in Breath of the Wild Masterworks a little bit about how they're trying to like they put together that Masterworks book because they were trying to not repeat the same mistakes that they made before. And I think that's good, because that does show that they make mistakes and that they're willing to learn from them. They typically do respond to player feedback. So yeah, I just wanted to really talk about that and get that out of my brain. It's been floating around in there for a good few months. If you gave me your time to listen to me talk about statistics of fictional content correctness, thank you so much. And I hope to catch you next time.